Okay, let us start. Finally, we have overcome all the difficulties and the problems of technology and communication, and we may begin our meeting of today. When we discussed it at our chair, the possibility of this event, we thought about the 8th of March. In Russia, this is International Women's Day, which has several meanings. One meaning, which is important for everybody in Russia, it is a holiday. So we celebrate everybody in Russia celebrate International Women's Day and don't go to work. So this is the most important factor of this International Women's Day. Second meaning is more romantic, of course, because the males are sending gifts and flowers and congratulations to women everywhere, to women colleagues and women in the family. And we will not talk about this kind of meaning of the International Women's Day. But of course, there is a historical and political meaning of this holiday, which we decided to devote today's meeting to combine our meetings with our American colleagues and the celebration of this international event and international important holiday. So I would like to give a floor to my colleague Irina Professor Khrulyova, who was one of the moving forces of these meetings with our colleagues abroad, and let her say a couple of words about today's meeting.
Okay, so, well, my great pleasure today is to introduce Glenna, my dearest friend and one of the leading historians in the field of women's studies. I know how active Glenna is. She has written 6 books. She's a very, very writing historian, which is wonderful. Yes, publishing and writing person. Glenna had her Fulbright in Moscow in 2002, and so we made friends, and we have been friends since that time. And I must also mention how deeply in love with Russian culture Glenna is. She's extremely fond of Russian literature. She has been learning Russian for all these years, which is absolutely exciting. She's fond of Russian music, especially ballet. Well, not only ballet, opera is also something that Glenna adores. Russian food, Russian something. So Russia is, everything Russian is Glenna's great interest. So I think I must really give floor to Glenna and let her talk finally.
Finally. Okay. Let's see. I'm on. So
as my student, Glenna, as my student, yes. Welcome.
I'm going to start with a little Russian. Я изучала русский язык, потому что я люблю Пушкина. И я хотела читать Пушкина по-русски. And now English. I want to begin in talking about American women in politics by looking at the 19th century background, because you don't understand the subsequent history if you don't understand something about what happened in the 19th century. The thing to remember is that in this country, we were in the early 19th century, there's a constant westward movement. And this was, of course, at the expense of Native Americans, of the Indians, but there were always new towns being founded. And we'd broken away from the Church of England when we broke away from being a British colony. We didn't have an established church. And so in each of these new towns, there needed to be institutions built, churches, schools, and clubs to organize the towns. And this meant that women had a role to play from the beginning. So in the 19th century, and of course there's a religious revival too, which gets women involved in, it's called the Second Great Awakening in the early 19th century. So there's a huge amount of organizing, particularly in the North, not so much in the South. Women create clubs, and then they begin from the clubs and the churches, they begin to organize to end slavery, to control drinking, prison reform, education reform. There's all this energy, and it's Black women are organizing clubs, white women are organizing, and it's just, one historian has called it the benevolent empire, because there was so much reform energy coming. So women didn't have a formal political role. They couldn't vote, and they didn't have the same legal rights that men had. Couldn't serve on juries, didn't have the same property inheritance rights, but they had tremendous influence on society and all this energy, and also better access to education. The first time that literacy was surveyed was in 1850, and there was almost no difference among white people of the literacy for women and men. So women were getting access to education, they were organizing, and out of that came the enthusiasm for getting the right to vote. So on my outline, I identify Seneca Falls. This is the first big 300 people, upstate New York. A group of women and men got together, and they debated women's rights. And there are several things that are important about Seneca Falls. They used the language. Elizabeth Cady Stanton drew up a document using the language of the Declaration of Independence, and said that all men and women are created equal. And so they debated whether women should have the right to vote, but they also talked about various ways that women didn't have full access. The great Black abolitionist, Frederick Douglass, was at this meeting, and he spoke up for women having the right to vote. So energy, then the formal call to have the right to vote in 1848. And by the way, 1848, it's really interesting because, you know, it's a year of revolution in Europe. It's the year that gold was discovered in California. So it's a year where all kinds of world historical things are happening, including this conference, the first of its kind. Then comes the American Civil War, and that kind of slowed things down, and women put their energy into war work. And then after the Civil War, various organizations emerge calling for women to have the right to vote. And the suffrage movement splits in two. One group says it's okay to give Black men the right to vote first, and the other group says if Black men are going to get the right to vote, then women should as well. But they reunite in the late 19th century. And then the final thing I want to mention on the subject of the 19th century is that beginning in the 1880s, women, well, if you know anything about American history, you know that this period sees tremendous immigration from Europe. The Industrial Revolution is, really going full swing, and corporate America is beginning to get very powerful. And so there's all large cities. I have to take a drink of water, excuse me. Cities in this country have tremendous social problems, urban poverty, crowded housing, blighted neighborhoods, and immigrants who are, not living the good life, to put it mildly. And so these women, there's this tradition of women taking action. They organize settlement houses in large cities. The first notable one is in Chicago, and it's called Hull House. And Jane Addams and her friends go into an immigrant neighborhood, create a home there, welcome immigrants, give immigrants lessons in how to function in this country. But they also ask the immigrants, you teach us about your culture, we'll give you some of the tools to function effectively in this country. Well, settlement houses are important because out of those, living in urban neighborhoods, these women and their male allies, because men became part of this movement too, they saw what was needed. They saw the kinds of new laws that were needed to reform. And many of the people who were active in the New Deal in the 1930s, when Franklin Roosevelt was president, got trained in how to function as reformers in society because of their experience in settlement houses. They were schools for teaching people how to be reformers. And so they were extremely valuable. So by the end of the 19th century, women still don't have the vote, but they have had a tremendous impact on society. There is an organized movement for women to get the vote. There's also another large movement, the Temperance Movement. And the great leader of the Temperance Movement, Frances Willard, interestingly, was a socialist. So it sounds, temperance, trying to control male drinking does not sound like a very progressive reform, but in fact, women were interested in it because husbands still had most women weren't gainfully employed outside the home. And so if a husband came home drunk, then, the whole family could be out of luck. So that was the single largest movement of women by the late 19th century, was the movement to control drinking. And the great leader was a socialist. She was interested in prison reform, many reforms besides just controlling drinking. And she advocated for women to get the vote. So the suffrage movement gained power from the fact that all these women were organized to control drinking, to control the problem of drinking. So as I say, when we go into the 20th century, there's a lot of female energy. And I want to particularly leave you with 2 points. One, Black and white women were both involved. And though white women, sometimes they cooperated well, other times white women were racist. They didn't want Black women in their organizations, but that didn't stop Black women from organizing. And so now we go into the 20th century, and I have on my outline a suffrage parade and its participants. And I recently read, I should tell you that one reason I'm fairly up on this is that one of the pioneering historians of the women's history and suffrage, Ellen Du Bois, has a new book that just came out last year just called Suffrage, and it's on the bibliography I provided. And I recently reviewed it. And in order to do a good job of reviewing it, I read a lot of the other new stuff that has been coming out so that I would be able to place it in perspective. And so another new book that is on your bibliography is by it's called Recasting the Vote. And the author of that book begins with a suffrage parade that took place in 1913. Woodrow Wilson was president, and the suffragists were determined that they were going to get the vote now. And this is the first time that you see large numbers of women by the thousands having parades in American cities and demanding the vote. And so there was a suffrage parade in 1913, right after Wilson took the White House. And the author of this new book points out, it wasn't just white women, Black women marched in that parade. There were Native American women, Indians marching in the parade, and one Chinese American woman. So the suffrage movement is beginning to broaden. And there were two great leaders, Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, and they're on your outline here. And they both played an important role, and so did their organizations, but they were very different. Alice Paul had spent time in England, where the suffrage movement was very militant. Women were going on hunger strikes and being force-fed and doing property damage. And so Alice Paul came back to this country, and out of her activism came a group called the Women's Party, and they were the militant ones. They were the ones that some of them chained themselves to the White House gates to protest. Carrie Chapman Catt led an organization that was the descendant of the 19th century organization, and they were institutionalists. They worked within the system. They went to see, they lobbied male politicians. They organized. And so you have energy coming from two different directions, the militants and the institutionalists. And I think it's fair to say that both played a role. By the time of the passage of the 19th Amendment and the ratification, which happened 100 years ago, last year, so 100 years ago in a few months, it was officially ratified August 26th, 1920. But by that time, a number of states had given women the right to vote. California, where I live, it was in 1911. But we weren't the first. There were some Western states, Colorado and Wyoming, who gave women the vote earlier. But with the 19th Amendment, all women get the right to vote. And so it's, you know, it's a big deal, a big moment. 1848, Seneca Falls, 1920, the 19th Amendment. And I have Ida B. Wells here on the outline. She's a good indication of the role Black women played. She was such a remarkable woman. Замечательно. To throw in a Russian word here, one of my favorite Russian words. She was born in 1862. Her parents were slaves. She was in Memphis, Tennessee. And as she grew up, she edited a newspaper, a Black newspaper in Memphis. And this was the era when lynching began to be really an ugly stain in our country. And she wrote editorials condemning lynching. And it became unsafe for her to stay in Memphis. So she moved to Chicago. And this woman wrote a book denouncing lynching. She traveled to the United Kingdom to, it was hard for her at first to get an audience, even in the North, because she was so outspoken. But then she got back to Chicago, wrote a book about lynching, organized among Black women, organized a suffrage club of Black women in 1913 in Chicago, actually ran unsuccessfully for the Illinois state legislature. And so she's one of these remarkable Black women that are involved in the suffrage movement. She was in that parade in 1913. And the other one that I didn't have on the outline, a woman named Mary Church Terrell, and the new biography of her is on the bibliography. She was a highly educated woman, Black woman. She went to Oberlin College, which was the first college in Ohio to admit both women and Black people. And she got, she studied classics at Oberlin, and then she went abroad and she learned French, German, and Italian. So she learned Greek at Oberlin. So she was a brilliant, highly educated woman, and one of the first two women to get a master's, actually, in this country, Black women. So she also was part of that suffrage parade. So by 1913, by the time of the suffrage parade and this final push for the 19th Amendment, there are some Black women who are just powerhouses. I don't know any other way to put it. I mean, they're in the face of terrible societal discrimination. They were staunch. And then I want also to mention one of our colleagues in this country, Tom Dublin, has been conducting research into Black women suffragists. And he has created a database, which is only going to grow, of Black women suffragists.
У нас тоже, короче, на втором курсе, в первом семестре была лекция.
Oh, извините, пожалуйста, выключите. Glenna, sorry.
Are we okay now? Da? So anyhow, there's this research into exactly who the active suffragists might have been is very much at the heart of cutting edge research in this country. So women get the vote by 1920. At first, they're not running for office very much. They're voting at a lower rate than men do. But along comes Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I think, Yuri, this is right up your alley, if I'm not mistaken. It's hard to overstate how important the Roosevelt administration, both Franklin and Eleanor, were in women's history, because Eleanor had been part of the settlement house movement. She knew all the settlement house, stalwarts. When Franklin Roosevelt was governor of New York, he had brought some of these settlement house women into his administration in New York. Therefore, when he became president, it was perfectly logical for him to bring those same women into the administration at the national level. And I have here Frances Perkins. Frances Perkins was the first woman to serve in a cabinet, which is, official presidential advisors. She was the labor secretary, and she drafted much important legislation. She was really a remarkable woman. Just the amount of influence she had, the way she pushed Franklin Roosevelt to, do things favorable to the labor movement. And of course, Eleanor is probably the most, how should I put it? I don't want to say she's the only first lady that's ever had this kind of influence, but really, she was a complete departure from anything that had been seen before. Eleanor advocated for women. She recruited women to run for office. She brought her friends into positions. She, nudged Franklin if he needed any nudging to bring women into positions of authority and influence. And this, throughout the 1930s, she was influential. And then I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but during World War II, there was one point at which she spent 5 weeks touring the Pacific theater of war and visiting soldiers who were wounded. So during the New Deal, Eleanor recruited women to run for office. Women began to be appointed to positions in the federal government. And Frances Perkins is at the tip of the mountain here because she's the first woman in the cabinet, and she has real influence, real power. And then I've also included the name of Mary McLeod Bethune, who was another one of these powerhouse African-American women. And she was an official member of the Roosevelt administration, a close personal friend of Eleanor's. And she was the head of what was called the Black Cabinet, which is kind of a shadow group of advisors on policies having to do with African Americans. And then, of course, World War II, moving forward in my outline. And World War II, I hesitate to even speak about the impact here because I'm very well aware that in your country, the suffering in the war was so extreme, so much dwarfed anything that happened in this country. But nonetheless, World War II had a tremendous impact on American society, even though we didn't have the kind of suffering by any stretch of the imagination that your country had. Before World War II, it was not typical for American women to be gainfully employed outside the home, especially middle-class women. World War II brought women into gainful employment. And my co-authors, I co-authored a book called Running as a Woman on American women and politics and running for office. And what we argue is that for white women, not necessarily for Black women, but for white women, they had been active in the public sphere. They wanted the vote to help other people. They didn't see themselves often as having personal interests. But then when they became gainfully employed, and for example, women working in war factories, American unions didn't always treat them very well. And so they began to experience gender discrimination in a way that they really hadn't had the occasion to, where it was, kind of in their face. And so we argue that out of this experience, women begin to advocate not merely to save society or help immigrants or abolish slavery, but for their own personal interests. And even though after the war, women didn't have the same need to be in the workforce, in fact, the change in society, the societal change that the war brought about, meant that increasing numbers of women were in the workforce to stay. And so the impact of World War II, it changed society economically, it meant women were gainful employees, women were having brand new experiences, and women politicians began to have a kind of a different agenda maybe. And there hadn't been that many women politicians, but there'd been a few. And then the next big, I have here the new feminism. The 1970s in this country were the big decade of the wave of new feminism. But before that, we have to mention that the birth control pill was invented in 1960 and began to be commercially available in the 60s. So here you have more women in the workforce, and they begin to be able to control their reproductive lives. Abortion was still illegal in this country, but with the pill, women had a more reliable way of controlling their when babies were going to be born. And I think those two things fostered the new feminism. And I can speak personally about this. I was a stay-at-home mom, and I had two little kids, and I managed to get my undergraduate degree, and I wanted to go to Stanford because I was living near that great university, and I couldn't move because I was a married woman. And the first time I applied to Stanford, I got rejected, and I applied in something other than American history. And I went to see the professor, and he said, "Oh yes, you're the housewife." And he didn't take me seriously. And that made me extremely angry. And this was in 1969, just as the new feminism was beginning to influence our thinking. And I had this, what we call an aha moment. And I decided that I wanted to change my field. And there was a professor at Stanford who was a pioneer in women's history named Carl Degler, my mentor. And I went to see him December 17th, 1969, which I will always remember. And I told him that I had been rejected by one of his colleagues, that I thought it was discrimination against women because I had extremely good credentials, and that I wanted to reapply, and I wanted to switch my field and do women's history and study with him. And I mean, I don't know where I got the guts to do this, but I said, I don't want to waste my time. And he said, we talked, and I told him, about myself, and he said, well, I can't promise you anything, but I think it's worth your applying again. And I did apply again, and I did get in, and I got a fellowship, and I was able, that encyclopedia of women's history that is part of the display of my publications, I dedicated to Carl Degler. I owe him so much. Well, what I did was happening all over the country. Women were beginning to think, what's wrong with this picture? And they were getting together, organizing what we call consciousness raising sessions. I never went to a consciousness raising session, but I read about it, where women would get together and talk about what was wrong with their lives. But then again, this tremendous organizing. In 1964, Congress had passed the Civil Rights Act, which also included provisions about discrimination on the basis of sex as well as of race. And so that's one foundation of anti-discrimination against women. Another foundation is in the early 70s, Title IX, which was going to punish universities that didn't engage actively in trying to end discrimination against women. And so there's all this, there's new public policy, there's new activism. And in 1971, the Supreme Court, for the first time, decides a case and acknowledges that gender discrimination should be protected, should be forbidden by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, which has been huge in attacking unfair practices in this country. So more women in the workforce, better reproductive choices, and women begin to look around, and after Title IX, women began to get much better access to medical school, law school. I mean, when I grew up, there wasn't a single woman that I ever saw in a position of authority. And now, I mean, in addition to the female office holding, which we'll get to, we've had a woman president of Harvard. We've had, women on the Supreme Court. We've had tremendous breakthroughs. It's thrilling to me that I lived long enough to see so much change for the good in this, from my standpoint anyhow, in this country. And then that brings me to what happened after the new feminism. And let me just take us to 1990, when my co-authors and I decided to write our book, Running as a Woman. At that point, there were 29 women in the House of Representatives out of 435. There were 2 senators. But we felt that change was in the air. And we thought that there was something, that there was something worth writing a book about, and that it was more possible. Before all these changes, women had often, if they did run for office, they had run as honorary men. They hadn't talked about women's issues. They had dressed in dark suits to look as much like men as possible. They had never particularly appealed to women voters. And we thought things are changing. And our favorite example, in 1990, a woman named Ann Richards was elected governor of Texas. And Texas was different then, let me put it this way. Drink of water. Ann Richards, who was an outspoken, witty, funny woman, a Democrat, posed for a picture with her hairdresser. She had this very bouffant hairdo, and it was a picture of herself with her hairdresser, and they had this funny slogan on it, and they sent it to every beauty shop. They made a postcard and sent that postcard to every beauty shop in Texas. And so we thought, this is an example of running as a woman. And anyhow, we thought change was in the air. Between the time we published our book in 1992 and now, well, we have a woman vice president now. We have 24 senators instead of 2. We have 119 members rather than 29. State governors, there were 1 or 2 then. So there has been growth in every level of office holding in this country. And we have a woman Speaker of the House. And Nancy Pelosi is an extremely powerful figure. I don't know whether some of the pictures of her standing up to former President Trump have ever been shown in your country, but she was, she gave, as we say in this country, she gave as good as she got. She would really stand up for her beliefs. So women have gone from, at first the women office holders were few, isolated tokens, and now many of them have real power. And I think they feel more comfortable advocating for issues of concern to other women, but not only for other women. They feel more freer to be themselves. And now not only do we have this huge growth in the number of women, but we have Native American women. We always had, I mean, not always, but for many years, we've had Black women. We have Latinas. We have, women from Asian American women. So the women are extremely diverse. And the final thing I want to say is that President Trump, who I will confess was not my favorite person, he inspired a huge mobilization on the part of American women. And women organized in unprecedented numbers. And just to give you an example, I mean, what I myself did, I wrote over 500 postcards to voters. That's when I say mobilize. That's one of the things. I mean, people were writing thousands and thousands and thousands of postcards to voters in what we call swing states. California, we knew was going to be in the Democratic column, but we sent thousands of postcards. We went door to door, and I should say that Republican women also organized, and so it's, women are players now in a way that we have never been. And with that, I will take questions, and I hope you were able to follow my English.
Oh, thank you, Glenna. We have already had a few questions, so you won't have a break. So you will keep talking and talking. So I think I may ask my colleague from Vladimir. I know that Glenna was in Vladimir.
Oh, da.
She really enjoyed the beauty of the city, of the region. So I think I will ask Olga just to voice her question. Olga Vladimirovna, can you ask personally the question? I think you wrote it to me, yeah? About the can you talk about the influence of the early feminist movement in France and the United Kingdom? Yes. Olga Vladimirovna, just switch on the sound.
Will Yurina just okay. Dear Glenna, thank you for your conversation, for interesting conversation. It's really glad to hear you, to see you. And my question is not really about nowadays, but about history. And I want to ask you about the influence of early feminist movement in France and the United Kingdom, and its influence for the formation of in the United States or in the USA. Sorry for my English.
Not at all. Well, going back to 1848, there is reason to believe that the American feminists at the time of Seneca Falls knew about the revolution in France. And then of course, French women didn't get the vote until after World War II. But so the two things I will mention with respect to France is the 1848 moment. And I think there's research ongoing about the influence back and forth. The great American woman intellectual, Margaret Fuller, traveled to France and Italy, and she was part of the revolution of 1848 in Italy. So she was a human link between the two countries. But then leaping forward to the 20th century, many of us read Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex. And I think that book, I mean, you know, there are very few books that you can say that book changed my life, but it was incredibly important to me to read that book. And interestingly, in 1989, I traveled to Barcelona and gave a talk there, and they had a luncheon for me, and I met a woman in Barcelona about my age, and we were talking about, both of us, she in Spain, I in the United States, had both been affected by reading Simone de Beauvoir. In the UK, it's mostly the fact that the Alice Paul went to the UK and came back with ideas of how to be more militant. And I should mention too that a number of, like Adia B. Wells, found an audience in the UK before she could find an audience in this country, because she was saying things that were so radical. What she was saying was that, you know, the justification for lynching was, oh, you know, that black man raped that white woman. And she said, well, maybe if there's interracial sex, it's because it was consensual, not rape. Well, that did not set well with a lot of American audiences. So she got an audience abroad before she got one here.
I understood. Thank you, Glenna.
Thank you, Glenna. So we have another question about the origins of the feminist movement in the United States. It's from one of my students, of Katya Kulagina, who studies the religious views of American just founding wives, actually, like Abigail Adams. And so as far as I can understand, it's just the difference of different denominations in the United States, the view. Actually, it in some way, it also correlates to my question. I wanted to ask you about, of course, some religious background of the participation or non-participation of women in political activities. Even nowadays, we know that there are some fundamentalist type of, you know, religious beliefs that all kind of deny access of women to this sphere. So can you comment a little bit on the role of religion in this sphere?
Well, going back to the 19th century, that it's such an important question. The more liberal Protestant denominations really played a role, and there were some Protestant ministers, particularly Unitarian ministers, who were very, very involved. But Henry Ward Beecher, brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, he was the president for a while of a suffrage club, and he was Congregationalist, I think. And the Quakers, many of the early suffragists were Quakers. So though the strong Protestant tradition in this country, particularly among the more liberal denominations, produced both male and female suffragists. Very important, very influential, and I think very sustaining that the people grounded their activism in a strong religious faith. And of course, jumping forward to now, yes, I mean, evangelical Christianity, that fundamentalist Christianity, has played a tremendous role in driving women to be active in the public sphere for very reactionary causes.
Thank you so much. So Glenna, I have a question about the celebration of the 8th of March in the United States. Is there any kind of tradition? Because a couple of years ago, I was in Italy on the 8th of March, and in Bologna, it was just a huge political event, and it was a real march, and people, well, it wasn't only, of course, women, it was just a great popular, I don't know, march or parade for women's rights, and and there was a great discussion on this particular day of the position of women in the society. Is any tradition in the United States of the 8th of March?
Well, that's a wonderful question as well. When I had my Fulbright, which was in 2002, I was amazed and delighted by all the fuss. I remember students bringing me flowers, and since then, and at that time there was nothing, but since that time there has been more attention. It's grown, but nothing like in your country or what you're describing in Italy. But of course, March is Women's History Month, and that's beginning to be, increasingly a big deal. I'm a basketball fan, and when I was watching a basketball game last night, the announcer said something about celebrating Women's History Month. So an unlikely place to have it mentioned, but welcome.
Thank you. So we have a question about the period of 1950s. So what do you think about this period of 1950s as a part of women's history? This period is widely known to be both about happy families with stay-at-home mothers and pre-feminism time, but Betty Friedan in 1963 wrote this magnificent book about the other side of 1950s. So what do you think about this book, comparing with the reality and the period itself? And you are thanked for your lecture. Well, everybody thanks you for your talk. But so this is a question about the 1950s and Betty Friedan's book.
Well, boy, there's a lot to say on this subject. That book, again, it's a book that had a tremendous impact. Yes, the 1950s, the stay-at-home moms, the the family togetherness. For my first book, which was called Just a Housewife, I did research at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I looked at women's magazines. And the message from the women's magazines was, all this glorifying the, most traditional woman. I remember one article about she has a Phi Beta Kappa pin, which means, she's a really good student, but she doesn't let the guys that she goes out with know about it. In other words, the idea was that a woman has to downplay her brains in order to, attract Mr. Wonderful, as we say. And I remember a Life magazine, I think it was Life. Anyhow, I remember an article about somebody arguing that women should not be showing ambition. And if you wanted to be the president of the Parent Teachers Association at your child's school, that might be too ambitious. You should In other words, here's something that's pretty conventional, but even that was seen as, ooh, you know, a little bit of dangerous ambition. And I have to say, when I was looking at these magazines in the 1980s and thinking, I survived all the messages that are coming from the culture. How did I ever, you know, emerge intact from those messages? And so then when Betty Friedan wrote her book, I mean, it had an enormous impact because, I mean, she talks about the problem with no name, and all kinds of women readers were saying, aha. And again, from research for my first book, I read some of the Betty Friedan papers at, again, I think it's at Schlesinger Library, and there are women writing into her and saying, I'm crying while I read your book, you know. People were just overwhelmed by the emotion of reading the book. I heard a story from a historian friend that a very distinguished historian of science, whose name escapes me now, but anyhow, she read the book, went down to her basement, got her senior thesis from college, which was about, I think, Isaac Newton, and decided, I did good work. I can go to graduate school. And so, you know, women were immediately inspired to take action. And yes, it was Betty Friedan was a difficult woman. My daughter, who's a journalist, actually covered her funeral. And she said it was one of those rare funerals where people talked about how difficult the dead person was. That's how difficult she was. But her book had a huge impact.
Thank you, Glenna. Well, of course, we have a question about Kamala Harris. It's a question from Anya. Do you think, being just elected as vice president, how will it affect feminism in general in the United States, American society in particular? So what do you think about the effect of Kamala Harris in America nowadays?
Well, I think again, it's one of those, it's such a moment. Particularly a lot of us were so bitterly disappointed when Hillary didn't make it to be president. But yeah, I think, I grew up where there was simply what you didn't, every dentist was a man, every doctor you saw, the school principal, every single authority figure in your life was male. And to have now women in positions of real authority, and I should, something that I didn't, Kamala is one of the real departures, but now we have the first woman who's been chosen to be the top executive of a baseball team. We have women as coaches in male sports. All this change. And so little girls now are going to be growing up in a world where it never occurs to them that everything isn't possible. And I think Kamala has a real shot at becoming president, hopefully not because Biden dies in office, but because I think she'll be positioned to run, in her own right.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. So, Glenna, you mentioned the temperance movement in the United States as part of the Second Awakening in mid-19th century. So, what do you think, about the movement, kind of female activism, if we speak about nowadays America, if we speak about problems like vaccination, like, just different types of protection from the pandemic, is this movement, women's movements, involved in this process? Can you see any parallels, or not at all, or it's nothing similar?
I haven't noticed so much with the pandemic. Again, this is, I mean, I think it's tragic, but there's very much of a partisan divide. Because for whatever reason, President Trump wanted to downplay the magnitude of the pandemic, and we have over 500,000 people who have died in this country. And somehow a lot of people seem to think that they have to not wear masks in public and you know, poo-poo, as we say, downplay the magnitude of the crisis. But I haven't really noticed a gender dimension so much as a partisan one.
I see.
May I ask the question as well, which correlates to what you're asking. Glenna, you gave us an overview of the women's movement and women's history in the United States. And generally speaking, we can see several big waves of women's activity. One is the suffrage movement, of course, the end of the 19th, beginning with the 20th century. The second wave was post-Second World War. It's a new feminism of the 60s. And the struggle for the amendment of the United States Constitution, equality amendment of men and women. But since that time, we see the changes, and from time to time, we see the growing of debates of the rights in the United States. But what do you think? What happened after the 1970s? It's just a gradual change, or everything is achieved, or there are no problems, or what is happening to feminism these days after this second wave?
Well, that's a wonderful question, Yuri. I think, well, I mean, look at office holding. I mean, it's gone into different channels maybe, but the dramatic change in the number of women running for office, that's huge, and that's ongoing. Every election cycle brings more women into running for office. And I wanted to mention, I should have mentioned this earlier, but when my co-authors and I were writing our book, we went to a series of breakfast meetings at a club in San Francisco, because I was then living in the Bay Area. And you'd look around the room and here were all these women who were, they weren't just somebody's wife. They were lawyers, they were professional women, they were business women, and they were dressed, you know, very stylishly and probably expensively. And I thought, oh my goodness, here are all these women who have real access to their own personal income. And when a woman candidate comes along, because these breakfast meetings were featuring women candidates, and the women who were at the breakfast meetings were writing the checks. And now, because of the changes of women going into the workforce, the changes of Title IX, women aren't just, you know, low-level jobs. They're at jobs where they can invest. And so all this female office holding and running for office is being fueled, not exclusively, but certainly to a significant extent, by the fact that women are in better positions to write checks for, you know, campaigns. And I think that I didn't mention the campaign to get the Equal Rights Amendment. There's been a wonderful book, which I might have put on my bibliography, by Marjorie Sproul, about a women's convention in a meeting of all these activist women in Houston in the 1970s. And, you know, feminists at that point thought, oh, we have smooth sailing, we're going to get the Equal Rights Amendment, we have the wind at our sails. What they didn't realize was that that was spurring a right-wing backlash. And that right-wing backlash prevented the ERA from being ratified. And, you know, we're still seeing very active right-wing women who are organizing to defeat a lot of the things that people who vote, you know, have my views would advocate for. And so two things are true. There's more right-wing activism by women, but there's more women writing checks and more women running for office.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Glenna, I have a question. As far as I understand, well, just female politicians are usually, well, discussed and criticized for their image, fashion, I don't know, hairstyle, whatever. What do you think, who was the main object of criticism recently, for example? And what female politician, I don't know, didn't attract this criticism at all? So, or you think generally, female politicians attract this type of criticism just about their image and the way they dress and the way they, I don't know, their gestures, hairstyle, whatever. Male politicians are not criticized usually for that. So,
well, that's, you know, it's indisputably true. Hillary Clinton was criticized. Her hairstyles changed too often. You know, she had broad hips, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, her enemies went over her physical appearance in a way that was really cruel. I think that might have diminished a little, but it certainly hasn't gone away. And I mean, obviously there's still a double standard for women and men. And people never ask a male politician who's going to take care of the children. You know, they're likelier to bring that up with a woman politician. And probably Kamala is well positioned because she doesn't have children of her own. She has stepchildren and they're grown. So nobody's going to be questioning that. And her husband, Doug Emhoff, the second gentleman, first time we've had a second gentleman, he seems like a wonderful partner. I mean, he's given up his lucrative legal practice because of conflict of interest problems. He's going to teach a course at Georgetown Law School. And he seems really supportive. And so I think they're breaking, not just appearance-wise, and Kamala's clothes are killer as far as I'm concerned. They are wonderful, but I shouldn't even comment like that. I shouldn't notice, but I did. But their marriage, which seems to be so, well, what you could wish, that her husband isn't some, you know, nebbish, as we would say. He seems to be a very powerful personality, and he's going to make his own way and be a partner. And so, you know, all of this is breaking new ground in this country.
Thank you. Glenna, and I know that, well, originally you intended to speak more about Eleanor Roosevelt. So can you just say a little bit more about her role in American feminist movement? Was she a feminist, by the way?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because as I say, she was so much her own woman. I mean, she was, as we say in this country, an ugly duckling child. I mean, she was, her mother was not particularly warm and loving to her. And her father was the kind one, and he was an alcoholic and died young. And so she had a very difficult upbringing. And then this glamorous, distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, courted her, and it must have been thrilling to her. And you know, people have written about their marriage, have said that the fact that her uncle was president of the United States might have been part of the attraction, Theodore Roosevelt, but that he also probably recognized somebody who was very substantive, you know, a real partner. And then they marry. He has a very domineering mother. So Eleanor is having to contend with a mother-in-law who's extremely bossy. She has, 6 children, one of whom died young. And she, out of all that, she insists on having her own life. Eventually, I don't know, Yuri, you must have gone to Hyde Park.
Yes.
Roosevelt, because, you know, Eleanor had her own home there, Valkill, because she didn't want to be all under the thumb of her mother-in-law. So she had her own little home at Valkill. And that's where, in fact, my daughter and I were at Valkill in the summer of 2019.
Yes.
And when you go there, they tell you this is the room where Eleanor received Nikita Khrushchev.
First of all, so if Masha will switch on my screen, I will show people the photograph of young Eleanor Roosevelt and her young husband.
Masha.
Yes, you can start see screen. Sorry.
Oh, yes.
So sweet.
Oh, that's a wonderful photo. I haven't seen it before.
Yes, and that's true. She, first of all, I can add what I can add to this in answering this question. First of all, she was a very active person in the Democratic Party, and she was organizing women to join the party and to be active in the Democratic Party. And this is true. In Hyde Park, which was the place which Franklin liked very much, himself, but there were some difficulties for them. First of all, Franklin's mother was a very hardline person, and she didn't get along with Eleanor very well. This was one matter. Second matter was that when Franklin got sick, it was difficult for him to stay in his father's home because of the construction. There was an old house with a lot of steps. And so they actually bought 2 new houses, one for Eleanor, which is in Valkill. And Eleanor created, at her house, she created the headquarters of the women's movement and the women's in Democratic Party. And she created a special what do you call, there were several other buildings erected in the place where some women who could come there, they could get some professions. So they could get some, they taught the women to do some things. And in addition to be active in politics. So it was a really very, very active participation in the political life. When the New Deal came, of course, she, and of course Roosevelt himself had difficulties moving around. And Eleanor did instead of himself. She had been traveling a lot around the United States, looking how the New Deal programs are working, and coming back and telling FDR what is going well, what is not going well. And certainly she was a very famous publicist. You know that she had this special column, My Day. Every day she published a column in the press. And almost every week she had a press conference on many issues. So she really played a very important role, both in the life of the Democratic Party and women in the Democratic Party, and in the New Deal. And after New Deal, as you remember probably, she was asked to become a member of the United States delegation at United Nations. And she participated in the creation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the United Nations. So she had really played a very important role in American politics and women's history as well.
A wonderful summary. I just want to talk about this photo a little. I think you can see in her face that she feels a little overwhelmed by the whole situation.
By the way, she looks gorgeous on this photo, you know.
Yes. But her husband was, incredibly handsome and dashing, and she looks a little tentative, but she grew out of it. She grew out of that tentativeness. And of course, I didn't go into the fact that she found out he was having an affair, and she stayed with him for the sake of his political future. But they had a partnership, and yeah, I mean, she was famous for going down coal mines. She went to all kinds of New Deal projects. And as Yuri pointed out, in the 1920s, when he was still really recovering, she was so active on his behalf in the Democratic Party. So I put on the bibliography the 3-volume biography by Blanche Cook, which I think is very good. And now Yuri, my granddaughter just went to Vassar, which is right near
Really?
Hyde Park. And so my daughter and I had the occasion to go to Hyde Park a couple of times because, oh yeah, there's another one.
There's another one. They are a little older here.
Yeah. I have to tell you the story then. We were at Hyde Park in, I think it was the fall in September of 2017. And I have arthritis, so I let my daughter go upstairs. I had already been upstairs years ago. And I sat on the porch, and I was sitting next to a woman older than I. And we got to talking, and she said, I haven't been at Hyde Park since 1944. She said, the last time I was here was election night of 1944. She was a Vassar student, and the Vassar students were put on a bus and taken to be part of the crowd celebrating the victory. And she said, when Franklin Roosevelt came out to greet the crowd and she saw how frail he was, she knew that his time was limited. But it was really quite remarkable to have somebody tell me, this is the first time I've been here since celebrating Roosevelt's victory in 1944. Anyhow, it's a wonderful place. You visit the home, the library, Valkill, and their graves, and it all has been deeply meaningful.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. So do we have some more questions? No? I have a question about the activity of the first ladies as we started speaking about Eleanor Roosevelt. So Glenna, what do you think about the reaction of the American society on such type of activities of the first ladies? So do you think that the society's attitude is changing? So it turns more now to the approval of such activity, or still there is a lot of criticism? Even if we speak about, I don't know, Raisa Gorbacheva, if we speak about the Soviet reaction to such an active first lady, being not just behind her husband, just near him, and
I remember Raisa very well. I mean,
and attracting a lot of publicity as well. So do you think that nowadays it is really different in the United States as well, or still women are very vulnerable in terms of criticism, like, I don't know, Hillary Clinton was when she was the first lady, but I think maybe Michelle Obama's image is extremely favorable, so she hasn't been criticized for all her project, or was she?
I wanted to talk about Michelle Obama. I thought she did a wonderful job. A first lady is supposed to be active, but not in anything controversial. For example, Lady Bird Johnson's project was beautifying the landscape. Laura Bush's project was literacy. And so that's kind of what the public wants. Somebody who's got, I mean, if we go way back to Mamie Eisenhower didn't have any projects. Mamie Eisenhower was a throwback, and so was Bess Truman, to the time before Eleanor Roosevelt. But then we begin to see a greater public role, but in something other than Hillary Clinton was an exception because she got involved in policy stuff. But Michelle Obama, I thought, did a wonderful job of child health and helping military families. So those were her two big issues. But our country is so polarized now that advocating for healthy school lunches was attacked. And Michelle was seen as advocating a nanny state, a state that was too intrusive. And it was really quite shocking to me that what seemed to me non-controversial. I mean, who wouldn't like healthy school lunches? But and I think, again, Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff are breaking new ground, but Dr. Jill Biden is breaking new ground as the First Lady. First of all, she's, I believe, the first Lady to have a doctorate, and she insists on being called Dr. Jill Biden. And she was criticized by the right wing for, oh, why are you making so much of, wanting to be called doctor? And there was a big flap. I was actually interviewed in a national publication about this subject. And of course I said, yes, she has every right to be Dr. Jill Biden, but now she's continuing to teach. She's teaching. And that's a throwback to Eleanor, as Yuri pointed out, because Eleanor wrote My Day and had professional activities. But I think other than Eleanor Roosevelt, no First Lady has ever done what Dr. Jill Biden is doing, which is to keep on teaching her community college students.
Well, I think we are running out of questions. I can't see. Oh, no, I have another question. So, wow, but this is really a serious one. So, what is the main theme of the initiatives of women members, female members of the House of Representatives in the United States? And is still the issue of protecting human rights still the main issue for female politicians, or it's now switching?
Well, that's a really interesting and good question. I think right now the Democratic women politicians are very eager to have President Biden's COVID relief bill passed. And it encompasses so many areas. It encompasses unemployment benefits. It encompasses greater funding for vaccination, money to state and local governments that have been really stressed by dealing with the pandemic, and then protecting voting rights. And I don't know, did Stacey Abrams get much attention in your country?
No.
because she's a wonderful exemplar of the new face of activist women. And again, this is pursuant to what Yuri said. Stacey Abrams is a Black woman who was active in the Georgia legislature and ran for governor in 2018 and didn't get elected. And I might say that she has wonderful credentials. I think she has a degree from, I think, Yale Law School, and another from the LBJ School at University of Texas. So she's really got credentials. When she didn't get elected governor of Georgia, she felt it was because of voter suppression, of people not allowing Black people to vote as freely. And she organized something called Fair Fight. And I can tell you that I have been donating monthly to Fair Fight because they are organizing to keep, voting in the hands of Black people, as well as, other people who might be marginalized. And so she didn't run for office in 2020. What she did instead was to organize in Georgia. And I don't know whether you are, how much you follow this, but in a special election, January 5th, 2 Democrats won in Georgia for the Senate. And now because of that, the Senate has is controlled by Democrats. And Stacey Abrams, this Black woman who did all this organizing, is generally credited as being the reason that there was that outcome in Georgia. She's a powerhouse. And again, the greater freedom, I mean, she's a formidable brain, but her day job is organizing, but her sideline is she writes romance novels. So if you want to find out one of the more interesting figures in America, Google Stacey Abrams, and she's just remarkable. Zamечательно.
Oh, thank you, Glenna. Thank you. So I think it's time for us to just start finishing our talk. And Glenna, well, in our chat, I have so many comments just thanking you for today's presentation. So happy 8th of March to you.
Well, and before I sign off, let me say, Irina has my email, and if any of the students who are watching are interested in asking me a follow-up question, or if there's any way I could possibly be of help in your research, I am very happy to be in contact with students. I love hearing from students, and it's been, I mean, I was heartbroken at the thought I wouldn't be able to do this. I was, because I really put a lot of thought, and my time at Moscow State University was one of the most thrilling experiences of my life. And it is so much fun to be able to zoom in. And yes, I already was interested in Russian culture, but after that experience, I took such a deep dive that my family began to run for cover, because every time I saw them, I would want to make a speech about Yevgeny Onegin or some recent wonderful discovery. So thank you so much for inviting me, and it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Glenna. Thank you very much. We enjoyed having you here in the cold Moscow. We still have winter, but winter has, but spring
lots
has
of sunshine and blue sky.
Sunshine,
So
yes.
it's beautiful.
So we would consider your lecture as a real beginning of spring in Russia, beginning of the International Women's Day. Thank you very much for a very, very interesting lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Great to see you, Glenna. Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye-bye.
In Laguna soon, Irina.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank